A very warm welcome to Professor Maike Oergel, who has managed to make it in these difficult times from her Nottingham base. I have a feeling that you've probably always been in Nottingham. I can't associate you with anywhere else. Well, it's yes. Well, I can't stayed a long time in Königsberg, staying in one place. Goethe stayed a long time in Weimar, so it's a good case for staying. Maike has published over a considerable range, and I quote, her abiding interest is the construction of identity in the context of cultural transfer, working across literature, history, and philosophy. And it's the duty and privilege of the president to introduce speakers, working often in very different areas of the subject, all related to Goethe and the Goethe Zeit, which is already ein weites Feld. But it's not surprising that they can be doing work that I don't know about or simply haven't caught up with. So it's always an element of humiliation, really, when introducing speakers who are doing all sorts of interesting things. For example, Maike's 1998 book on the return of King Arthur and the Nibelungen, national myth in 19th century English and German literature, wouldn't necessarily have landed on my desk. But her more recent publication, Zeitgeist, How Ideas Travel, Politics, Culture, and the Public in the Age of Revolution, 2019, is on the central theme in the history of ideas. How do they get about? And so there's a certain shame in not having taken note of that book or taken issue with it, and I really will catch up with it, only incidentally to see whether she came across my Goethe Jahrbuch essay on Zeitgeist in 2002. Maike said she didn't want a long introduction, so I will just add that tonight's paper grows out of discoveries from the research that she did for the Zeitgeist book, and we look forward to hearing about two unfamiliar Randfiguren and their perspectives on the French Revolution. Maike.
I can see that the online audience is all muted now. May I ask you to stay muted for the duration of Maike's paper, and may I also ask you to keep your camera switched off for the duration of the paper, and we'll then change the mode once the lecture is over and we have the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. I hope everybody can hear me online. I mean, people can hear me here. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and the invitation, of course. I'm delighted to be here. So, Randfiguren, marginal figures. What do I want to do with them? I've got three areas or three parts of the paper. The first one is a sort of, well, they're methodological aspects. What are they good for, these Randfiguren? And then I'm going to move on to these two Randfiguren, Hendrich and Brandes. What do they actually say about the French Revolution and about politics? And finally, how do contemporaries see them, bearing in mind that we don't seem to see them at all anymore? So, the methodological aim, marginal figures. What I mean by this in this context are writers that were sort of yesterday's heroes, widely read in a past time, but now consigned to obscurity. They enjoyed what I would call provisionally temporary canonicity. So it didn't last, but canonical for a while. I think this is potentially a useful concept. It tells us something that we are no longer aware of about a period, or about that period when they were big, about their historical moment. It may also tell us something about historical change. Why did they descend into obscurity? Now, my guess is they present or grapple with a view, a value, or a practice that became either less pressing or less desirable. Now, of course, there is a caveat to Randfiguren. it's not true for every marginal figure. There's always the possibility that one is marginal because one didn't say it as well as others, or because one wasn't very original. But if there are interesting Randfiguren, then I think they can give us a new window on their historical moment. So, Randfiguren with temporary canonicity. Useful because I think they provide a way to reduce blind spots created by hindsight and preoccupations of later observers. Because we don't take a sort of historical perspective through time, but a kind of horizontal perspective across a period. They also provide a way to recognize a perhaps lost complexity of the historical moment. And putting that together, I suppose one could interrogate any sort of canon through this, but that's a big one. I think it's particularly easy, or it's become a lot easier to discover Randfiguren because of digitization. The sheer volume and easy accessibility of material gives us a chance to find them and assess them. It is easier to find out, once one's found them, what their contemporaries thought of them, for whom they weren't Randfiguren. And another question would be, well, exactly that obscurity thing. Why did they not make it into the canon or the master narrative? Why did they become marginal? So, Brandes and Hendrich. They are such widely read but ultimately non-canonical German writers. And I think they offer a sort of interesting take on the contemporary German construction of the political role, identity, and future of the third estate, or die Bürgerlichen, or shall we call them das Bürgertum? Anyway, what is that? This is a sort of bit of a problem of concept and translation. Bürgertum, is that the Bürgerlichen, or is it just the middle classes? Or are they commoners? So bear that in mind, that this is a potentially difficult term. And what about the Bauern und Bürger, who are frequent people in the texts I'm going to discuss? So Bauern, probably not farmers, but peasants. Bürger, well, are they burghers, are they citizens, or are they commoners? In 2003, Sarah Mazza proposed that bourgeoisie, the French word, is not a useful category in revolutionary France. She said it doesn't exist. Well, that was her provocative moment. My thesis is that such a category of broadly middle-class citizens was constructed by German contemporaries of the revolution in a political sense. And Hendrich and Brandes are part of constructing that. Now, in the German context, this question also always addresses the issue of the weakness and political underdevelopedness of the middle classes or the third estate. So this is a contribution to the question of whether a self-aware political citizen class existed in Germany, well, at the end of the 18th century, or whether it was at least constructed or imagined as such. That's my new perspective. Specific new insight: Brandes and Hendrich were supporters of the early stages of the revolution, and both had a sense of the political and social role of this Bürgertum or Bürgerlichen in the process of moving from feudal absolutism towards constitutional representative government. Hendrich more so, or more explicitly than Brandes. So, to assess their views of the political role of the Bürgerlichen, I will focus on their views on constitutional reform and political participation. There is considerable overlap between their views. Hendrich is more liberal than Brandes. So, first of all, perhaps a little bit of biography. Brandes is a self-conscious member of the upper middle classes. Hendrich is a member of the nobility, who identified, nevertheless, with the non-aristocratic interest in political change and felt that his own class needed to adjust to new social realities. So, there is a little bit of biography. You can see they are roughly the same generation. Brandes is from the Kurfürstentum Hannover. That's where he was born, where he worked, and where he died. Hendrich is from the many Saxonies. He's born in Sachsen-Coburg-Saalfeld, but he spends his working life and basically his adult life in Saxe-Meiningen. Both are civil servants, Staatsdiener. Hendrich is a Geheimer Rat and high up in the administration and at times the government of Saxe-Meiningen. And Brandes is Geheimer Kanzleisekretär and the Referent der Universität Göttingen. Now, Randfiguren, not much reception. Brandes has had a limited reception. He's got a tiny wiki page where you are informed that Ernst Brandes war von großer Bedeutung für die Entwicklung konservativen Denkens im Zeitalter der Französischen Revolution. So if he has been received, it's as a conservative. Now, Hendrich hasn't had a reception at all after he kind of drops out of being quoted in the sort of mid-19th century. No wiki page, nothing. So contemporary, Goethe thought Hendrich was a political troublemaker who was, quote, running around fanning the flames at a time when it would be better to grab water buckets. That's from a letter to Hufeland. To get a sense, they might be slightly different, but nevertheless, there is quite a lot of overlap, as we shall see. Their discussions circle around the roles of the aristocracy vis-à-vis the third estate, or Bürgertum, or the Bürgerlichen, and the future relationship between these two groups. They themselves represent perhaps an uneasy relationship or the connection between these two groups. In the end, both suggest that there needs to be closer alignment between these two groups. That liberal intellectuals were keen on the revolution in 1789 in Germany or in Britain is well known. Hendrich and Brandes are intellectuals, but they are mainly political practitioners. They self-consciously speak as pragmatists who draw on practical experience, on political praxis, not theorists or abstract philosophers. Their work, both their works, circle around the revolution. That's not surprising. I mean, that's the big thing when they were around. Between 1790 and 1797, Hendrich devoted volumes explicitly to the revolution, Brandes too, but at the end of his life, he will return to sort of the effects of the revolution. So if we have a quick look at what they published, perhaps we don't need to go through all of this. The key difference is Hendrich always publishes anonymously, whereas Brandes always, he is himself, books are published normally, publisher, place of publication, whereas Hendrich goes for these kind of rather fashionable Germanien and not saying where and who is writing those. So his first famous book, and is perhaps the one that maybe he is known for, Freymütige Gedanken über die allerwichtigste Angelegenheit Deutschlands, 1794. It goes through actually two print runs in 94, so pretty successful. And he rewrites the book within a year, much extended, the ganz ungearbeitete und vermehrte Auflage, now 3 volumes, 1795. If only one could get the dates right, 96. And again, his last book explicitly about the revolution is Über den Geist des Zeitalters und die Gewalt der öffentlichen Meinung. Brandes is slightly kind of quicker off the mark. He publishes Politische Betrachtungen über die französische Revolution in July 1790, that's before Burke, and follows up in 1792 mit über einige bisherige Folgen der französischen Revolution in Rücksicht auf Deutschland. The first book really looks at France, whereas the second book then, what's the revolution doing in or for Germany? As I said, Brandes has had a little bit of a reception. He sort of stayed on the radar of historians mainly because of his association with Edmund Burke, whom he met as a young man. Burke was a very mature person, on a visit to England. And he kept in touch with Burke for the rest of Burke's life. And he was a close friend of the Freiherr vom Stein. So he seemed to be on the radar because of that. So what do they say? Neither in the first publication is entirely hostile to the revolution. Both think there are useful and necessary aspects to the revolution. It's the right direction, just goes too far. Neither proposes to go back to ancien regime practices. The agreement on many key aspects, which I'll go through in a minute, should make us reconsider the representative nature of their period. So, what is the overlap in views? Both are in favor of political change, not revolution, but change. They want to influence public and princely opinion. It's a sort of warning to the princes, but really they are addressing the public. In 92, Brandes is exploring whether revolution is possible in Germany. In early 94, Hendrich really wants to forestall a violent revolution in Germany without giving up on reform. Hendrich really is spurred into writing by the revolution. He starts Freymütige Gedanken in 93 and is then published in early 94. Brandes was already suggesting the need for change in his essays from the mid-1780s. But what he wants is the British model. Both think rulers are complacent. There is systemic political corruption and widespread abuses of power. The third estate are justifiably restless. Both have read ABCS, What is the Third Estate? And they agree with him that the problem is the aristocracy and also despotically absolutist princes. The aristocracy are an unfairly privileged class, and the princes are fallible human beings who've got used to absolutist practices. Brandes says, der französische Adel hat sich alles selbst zuzuschreiben. The French aristocracy only has itself to blame. And he goes on, this is in the 1790 book, considering, I'll just read the English quotations, considering the outrageous pressure that was exerted on everything that did not enjoy the protection of great or small tyrants, it remains almost incredible that such a great and spirited nation, the French, has been able to tolerate these horrors for so long without a general uprising. Hendrich, in 94, talks about Germany. The faults in the ways of governing are mainly due to the pressures of the titled classes, due to the power of princes who have risen too far above moderate forms of government. In France, the government is to blame for the violent revolutions. And Hendrich goes on to warn, the people will no longer willingly bend their necks under a yoke, since they now know their rights, their rulers' duties, and their own strength. It's a sort of theme of his. Die Bürger kennen ihre Rechte, and they also know their Herrscherpflichten. Not surprising, both are admirers of Montesquieu. They hate despotism. They oppose its refinement, absolutism, just as much. They advocate a limited constitutional monarchy. For both, there are two types of despotism. Despotism of rulers, Fürstendespotismus, and despotism of the mob, Pöbeldespotismus. Both, again unsurprising, are fierce constitutionalists. There needs to be a separation of powers and representation of the people, Volksrepräsentation. For Brandes, a bad constitution is where the people, das Volk, do not participate in legislation, directly or indirectly. Volksrepräsentation is necessary, and there needs to be a bond between the representatives and the people. Well, voting for them is one way of creating that. This is to avoid, Brandes says, the evil of pure aristocracy. Interestingly, in 1790, Brandes suggests a franchise of 50% would be appropriate. Now that's quite a lot. Hendrich agrees. He says, the duty to govern well includes giving the state a well-organized constitution. People have the right to expect vernünftige Freiheit. Constitutions need to be amended to keep up with the times. It has to be possible to make zweckmäßige Abänderungen, amendments, even if that means giving up some rights. Wären es auch Aufopferungen. Now, he doesn't mean Aufopferungen of the folk, he means Aufopferungen of the aristocracy and the prince. He even hints at the fact that he sort of agrees with the idea of the social contract. Könige und Fürsten, kings and princes receive their rights through contracts with the nation. Representation of the people is necessary. For Hendrich, any existing constitution is not fit for purpose because Bürger, Handwerker and Bauern, so whatever they are, craftsmen and peasants and Bürger, have no rights. They only have duties, taxes and worth. Brandes in 92 advocates an assembly of notables. The best people, titled and untitled, should be the brake on power. In 1789, France, for Brandes, had no constitutional government because there had been no representation through the general estates for far too long. And when they were called, they weren't fit for purpose. The new National Assembly, Brandes says, in 1790, needed to be defended by violence, otherwise it would have been crushed and wouldn't have got the chance to create a proper constitution. For him, that would have been something like the British Constitution. However, in mid-1790, he recognizes that they have failed and they're not going to create a kind of good constitution. This is due to the intransigence of the aristocrats and the royal party and the rise of the radical Democrats. So aristocrats on one end and Democrats on the other, they've made a mess of it. But nevertheless, Brandes still expects anything that they'll come up with in 1790 to be better than the unconstitutional despotism that France had before. So, what would be a good practical separation of powers then in Germany? Both promote, and this may come as a bit of a surprise, a revival of general estates, what I would call old liberty, i.e. in Germany, revival of the Landstände and re-empowering the Reichsstände. Hendrich sees the whole kind of weakening disappearance of the Landstände as directly linked to the rise of absolutism. And he has some faith in the federal imperial structures, especially the Reichstag, the imperial diet in Regensburg. But in 1796, in the Neue Freymütige Gedanken, he advocates that Bauern should also have not just representation, but political participations on the local level. Dorfgemeinden should be able to elect the people who lead them, and possibly even their representatives higher up. He doesn't think they necessarily elect Bauern, other peasants. They could go for local priests or local landowners, Gutsbesitzer. Now, Brandes, in theory, welcomed the calling of the general estates in 89, some sort of return to constitutional government in France. And the National Assembly was a real chance, but as we heard, they messed up. This chance was wasted. Incidentally, both of them have a real problem with large standing armies. This is kind of something that came up along with that despotic absolutism. Hendrich calls large standing army Stütze des Despotismus, support of despotism. And Brandes agrees. So going for an estate-based body for the separation of powers tends to be interpreted as conservative because it limits the equality of citizens. Looking closely, though, neither advocates a wholesale return to early modern pre-absolutist times, because both demand that the aristocracy relinquish privileges for moral reasons of fairness and for pragmatic reasons of maintaining order, peace, and safeguarding property. Hendrich says, the aristocracy must relinquish those privileges that harm the common good, the gemeinschädliche Privilegien. And this has to be an unconditional renunciation for the benefit of the common good and for their own security. Because the main thing now is the prosperity of the Bürger and especially the lower classes, die niederen Stände. This, for Hendrich, is vernünftige Freiheit. Brandes, slightly less outspoken but still agrees. He says, the times have arrived when the privileged classes have to renounce some privileges to secure others. But which privileges should they give up? Well, they agree on one, the exemption from taxation. Hendrich also wants to abolish key aspects of the feudal order, the Lehnsrecht, including Frondienste, free labor by unfree peasants. He thinks aristocrats can work with their hands or they should trade. Hendrich is deeply suspicious of feudalism, echo of Montesquieu. For him, that's a form of slavery, and the Middle Ages, all of it is quite suspect for him. He sums it up as Despotie und Aberglaube, despotism and superstition. So really bringing back old liberty. So what about the separation of powers? Now, well, both strongly advocate, very strongly, a free press and publicity of public affairs, of government. Brandes, in fact, thinks this is more important than the vote, although he, of course, also encouraged a broadening of the franchise, as we heard. For both, publicity is part of the separation of powers, a check on power. Both, of course, are great believers in the general reason of the public and the public sphere. For Brandes, this is the enlightened part. This is the enlightened public sphere. So it's not everybody. Hendrich, a little bit more, doesn't really say that much about it, but he makes quite clear that his Gedanken are not addressing the masses. So, old liberty or not, to what extent is taking key privileges from the aristocracy dismantling them as a class or an estate? Let's have a quick look at equality, Gleichheit. What do they say about this? Both support equality before the law. Hendrich talks of Menschenrechte, human rights, Gleichheit vor dem Gesetz, equality before the law, and Schutz vor willkürlicher Macht, protection from arbitrary power. And of course, equality of taxation, Gleichheit der Abgaben. But not the abolition of the Stände. Gleichheit der Rechte is not the same as Gleichheit der Stände. So equality of rights is not the same as the equality of classes. However, gemeine Bürger and Bauern need representation and participation. Not least because they are the most useful Staatsbürger, der nützlichste Teil der Staatsbürger. They are productive, they feed the aristocracy and the clergy. This is straight out of CS, of course. Brandes wants to keep the aristocracy. They should stay, maybe even be compensated for their loss of privileges, in his view, with an upper house, not Britain, House of Lords. But it's quite clear that this is for pragmatic reasons, because he thinks they're selfish and intransigent. But if one doesn't, if one wants to abolish them, the strife will never end. And he is adamant that aristocratic privileges need to be curtailed. Henry suggests that they might merge with the middle classes in terms of wealth and influence. He's very keen on increasing the number of Gutsbesitzer, landowners, and he is against increasing or even practically against hereditary aristocracy. Both perform an uneasy Gratwanderung, advancing potentially radical ideas while assuring the reader that they are loyal subjects who must just be allowed to speak truth to power. They position themselves both self-consciously in the center ground. Henry says he is neither an aristocrat retaining privileges because they are not antisocial, nor a democrat demanding all privileges are given up because they are antisocial. Although he suspects he will be considered both by less centric parts of the political spectrum. Brandes in 1790 positions him as for liberty. Freiheit ist seine Sache. And he quite goes on about this. He says, I will oppose many of the Democrats' principles just as vigorously as those of the aristocrats and the supporters of despotism. I don't think that the supporters of despotism have ever counted me among their friends. They will never be able to count on me for their defense. One person who has looked at Brandes in greater detail, but probably the only one, Karl Haase, in the early 70s he wrote a Brandes biography, has argued that Brandes uses camouflage tactics to protect his progressive political ideas from conservative Hanoverian ministers. So I'm wondering whether the revival of the Lunchstände in the mid-1790s might also be a tactic to make change more acceptable. Clearly, both revise old estate-based practices. Brandes suggests in 1790 that at least the French general estates were not fit for purpose. So why are the German estates then? Brandes suggests, Brandes thinks the French general estates are no good. Hendrich suggests that Bauern ought to choose their reps. Both want to disprivilege the aristocracy. On the whole, that's not old liberty. Hendrich and camouflaging. In the context of talking about the need for political reform and enfranchising the Bürgerlichen, he quite strategically quotes Brandes and Friedrich Gentz in 1795, because their verdict is not suspicious, because they are opponents of the new political faith or unfaith. He talks neuer politischer Glauben oder Unglauben, and he leaves that. He doesn't say what he thinks, whether it's a Glaube or an Unglaube. But he clearly wants to sort of say, well, look, I'm not the only one who is saying this, and even people who don't like the revolution think there has to be change. In their vision of an improved constitutional situation, aristocracy and Bürgerliche would necessarily need to move socially, politically, and economically towards each other. One big class, although they will be widely differing in wealth, but equal in terms of rights before the law, occupation, and taxation, with gradually increasing numbers of property owners. Both agree no tax privileges and increasing representation are the way forward. Hendrich is clear on this approximation of Adel und Bürgertum. He conceives of a newly inspired and socially influential middle class that is distinct from the rest of the Third Estate. He says, not only the Bauer and the lower class Bürger, der Bauer und gemeine Bürger, is dissatisfied. Dissatisfaction seems to be even more widespread among the large and highly influential class between these two and the Adel. This class, which is now connecting through an esprit de corps, is not only numerous, they are also the richest in terms of scientific education. They alone provide the teachers of the higher and the lower classes, the writers of our nation, and they direct public opinion. You can't ignore them. And he goes on, in France, their Mittelstand were driving the revolution. They founded, he says, the Republic. So is the recreation of the French nation, Umschaffung der französischen Revolution. Okay, it's accompanied by Gräuel, horrors, but it holds great promise. He says, I have no intention to cast through these points, they created the French Republic, a shadow or suspicion on the middle classes, whom I hold in very high esteem. For the good that will come from this fomentation, which now seems to settle down, they will be due our gratitude. He thinks things are settling down because this is 95, and he thinks the directory is a really good thing in France. And he concludes, der deutsche Bauer und Bürger ist seiner politischen Unmündigkeit entwachsen. So the German Bauer and Bürger has outgrown their political immaturity. Hendrich is an enlightener. He believes in progress and human development through education. For him, the Mittelstand's increased power is not only based in their economic clout, but on their intellectual moral power, their skills and their knowledge. Brandes agrees that only educated and propertied citizens should be fully enfranchised. But Brandes sees an issue with full political emancipation of the middle classes in their lack of inherited property. Even rich merchants' wealth is volatile and doesn't leave them much time or not enough leisure for politics. This is Germany, not Britain. He has this English idea. And that's a traditional line of the German weak middle classes. But even for Brandes, they are weak only in one respect. If one had more Gutsbesitzer, things would be a lot better. And Brandes' entire work echoes with the resentment of the Großbürger who feels the aristocracy is keeping them out. He returns to this in no uncertain terms in 1808, near the end of his life. So, contemporary reception. Well, we've already seen Hendrich's Freymütige Gedanken sold very well in 1794. The third extended edition also did pretty well. The 95 extended edition, the preface reveals sort of the Jacobin controversy about about Hendrich. He's picked up by Professor Geheimer Hofrat Gruner of Jena, professor at Jena University, for demanding abolishing privileges. Surely this is wrong and dangerous. People who ask this, Gruner thought, were Illuminaten und Jakobiner. And Hendrich, of course, rebuts this and says, no, that's not me. Gruner and Hendrich carry on to argue about privileges of the aristocracy and whether revitalizing the Landstände, which Gruner also thinks is a no-no, for the next 20 years. They still do this in 1814. Anyway, back to 94. Göttingische Anzeigen reviews Freymütige Gedanken, the first edition, on the whole favorably, slightly lukewarm. Is Freymütig all right? But the reviewer, they tend to play down the more radical aspects, the Verbesserungsvorschläge. They're not necessary because we already have all these things. And the governed need to improve before they can be given more rights. But this is all quite sort of like, oh, this is a good book, but on the whole, I don't agree that much. The more liberal aspects of the book, the reviewer thinks, are really politische Träumereien, political dreams. The Allgemeine Literaturzeitung only reviews Freymütige Gedanken after the 3-volume edition comes out in 96. It acknowledges the success of the book in terms of sales. Again, it's generally positive, but also a little bit lukewarm. But it can't find anything wrong with the suggestions that the author makes. It lists most of them, but avoids to comment. What is interesting here, this kind of playing things down, is a bit, okay, this is a good book, but there is little new and little unerhörtes. So it seems to say, well, we know all this radical stuff already, and not that controversial. Well, we already know what Goethe thought about Hendrich's Freymütige Gedanken, because that's what he was, he clearly was an early reader of the book, because the letter to Hufeland is in July 94. The book had only been out 3 months. Brandes' contemporary reception is a little bit more prompt, because even when Politische Betrachtungen comes out, Brandes is well known. So it's reviewed promptly by the Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliothek in 91, as is the second book, Bisherige Folgen, in 93. The Allgemeine Literaturzeitung is again a little bit slower off the mark. It only publishes a sort of Sammelrezension in 97 of both books together. In 91, the Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliothek is favorable, establishes Brandes as an eminent writer, and finds the book on the French Revolution, which defends the violence of the revolution, of the storming of the Bastille, meisterhaft und zweckmäßig, masterful and good purpose. But also says it should be read in conjunction with Burke's Reflections, which has meanwhile come out. But it doesn't tell us whether it should be read like they both say the same, or there are differences here. Most interesting is Johann Gottfried Fichte's arch-defender of the revolution until 93. In picking up on Brandes' book, Fichte in his very Berichtigung der Urteile des Publikums über die französische Revolution, his justification publication in 93, quotes Brandes and he congratulates him on his independent and impartial thinking on the topic of the revolution. He's talking about the 1790s book. And he makes quite clear that he considers him not very conservative. 15 years on, Johann Wilhelm von Archenholz, himself a committed liberal, in his Minerva, still praises Brandes as the famous writer, generally favorably. However, the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung in their Sammelrezension, which came out eventually in 97, criticizes Brandes a little bit, well, because they think he's not liberal enough. They're unhappy about what the reviewer says as a protection of the aristocracy. So it seems contemporaries on the whole were divided on where to place Brandes on the liberal conservative stance or on that kind of spectrum. And Brandes predicted this at the end of Betrachtungen. And similar with Hendrich. Gruner thinks he is a Jacobin, but the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung thinks, well, there's nothing controversial here, really. So, speculation. Why did Brandes not become canonical, der berühmte Schriftsteller? Well, one of the reasons is probably his close association with figures who have had a more lasting and canonizing reception, Burke and Stein. So he's sort of overshadowed by his friends. Frequently, it has been assumed that, if Brandes is discussed, that he was influenced by Stein. Similarly, he is often presented as spouting Burkean views, although his book appeared earlier. In 1790, Brandes and Burke agree generally politically, but in 1790s, despite this agreement, they diverged sharply on the French Ancien Régime. In Politische Betrachtungen, Brandes is highly critical, as we saw, of what he thought was the regime's despotism. In Reflections, Burke is more forgiving. Another reason why Brandes has remained an obscure conservative is no doubt his broadly reactionary social conservatism. That's quite unpalatable for the 20th century. Any political progressiveness in him come with a pronounced sexism and social elitism. Rejection of mass education, of educational philanthropism. He comes across on that front as reactionary and bigoted to 20th and 21st century eyes. Why is Hendrich not canonical? Well, he doesn't seem to be anything these days. That's a good question. He seems to be someone who was just forgotten. Was he too unplaceable? He still gets quite a few favorable mentions through the 1830s as a sort of forward-looking constitutional thinker. But then he disappears. Both of them. Perhaps they didn't quite fit into emerging narratives. Neither fit the master narrative that political awareness and political nous were underdeveloped in the German middle classes or those who supported them. The complexity of their political stances is difficult to place, veering between radical ideas, pragmatism, and camouflage. Equally fluid, of course, is the political situation to which they react. Opinions are being formed and reformed. Brandes certainly says different things about the revolution at the end of the 90s than he does in 1790. But what is also becoming perhaps clearer is the fluidity between emerging liberalism and emerging conservatism. Both Brandes and Hendrich utilized the old liberty idea, the Landstände, but strongly modified this to move forward, to find a way to channel middle-class political ambitions. Retaining the aristocracy seems to be mainly a pragmatic move at this stage. So Brandes is revealed as a not quite so conservative writer, we can believe Fichte, who formulated a position on moderate reform. Hendrich is revealed, well, in his explicit construction of a growing middle class, of a broad Mittelstand, who is a politically active citizen class, which it seems to the Allgemeine Literaturzeitungsreviewer was not a very far-fetched idea. So maybe this does something to modify our view of established political positions against the backdrop of the French Revolution.